Ukraine has just defeated Russia. All enemy troops have been sent packing back to Moscow with their tails between their legs. For the first time, Vladimir Putin's position on both the domestic and international stage looks fragile at best and untenable at worst. The West, most notably NATO and the European Union, or EU, has welcomed Ukrainian membership with open arms. After a fierce fighting and a huge loss of life on both sides, with millions displaced and their homes destroyed, Ukraine has finally emerged victorious and reached the European promised land. A hugely unlikely scenario, or a very real possibility in the not-too-distant future? That's the question many would struggle to answer at this crucial juncture, even if journalist Sean Walker has gone on record as saying there are still plenty of people in Ukraine who believe they can prevail, given adequate military support from the West. At present, Russia controls 18% of Ukraine, but at what cost? According to a U.S. intelligence report by Reuters, the number of dead or injured Russian troops exceeds 315,000. Battleships have been sunk, bridges and essential infrastructure were destroyed in Crimea. Hard-fought territorial gains have been reversed in the most emphatic fashion. In July 2023, the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who has praised the extraordinary resilience of the Ukrainian people, noted that they had retaken roughly 50% of the territory seized by Russia since the 2022 invasion. But is that enough to turn the tide and deliver ultimate victory to Zelensky and his people? And if so, what does Ukraine need to win the war against Russia? Put quite simply, weapons, 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 and lots of them. As the war enters its third calendar year, Kyiv needs more of everything: air defense ammunition, air defense systems, artillery shells, howitzers, tanks, drones, long-range missiles, most pressingly the Army Tactical Missile System or ATACMS, and fighter jets to continue targeting Russian bases in Crimea. This is nothing new, however. From the onset of the conflict, Ukraine has received huge military backing from predominantly Western nations that condemned Putin's act of aggression. Without that backing, the war might have been over as swiftly as the Russian leader boasted at the start of the, quote, special military operation. In fact, according to the BBC, one of his grander proclamations, Ukraine has returned to Russia, had to be deleted from the state-owned RIA Novosti news agency's website when his forces were met with such fierce resistance from Zelensky's troops. But in terms of that much-vaunted military aid, the sheer numbers involved are eye-watering, to say the least. According to another BBC report, the United States alone has already pledged $43.6 billion, a staggering, almost unprecedented figure in the context of any war. But it doesn't begin and end with the US. Germany has provided $18.1 billion, the UK $6.9 billion. Even Finland, a country with a population of only 5.6 million people, has given $1.6 billion of financial assistance for military purposes. But what comes next? Will the military aid packages dry up now the war has become so prolonged and attritional? Or can Ukraine's allies continue to supply the kinds of weapons the country so desperately needs to be victorious in the end? Fortunately for Zelensky, Ukraine's allies have pledged more serious military hardware to use against Russian forces in the coming year. First off, tanks, a crucial factor in Ukraine reversing the gains Russia's made since launching its devastating attack. The US is sending 31 Abrams tanks, the UK shipping 14 Challenger 2 tanks, Germany is providing 14 Leopard 2 tanks, and Spain is adding 6 of the same model. Ultimately, success on the battlefield is just as dependent on a vast range of equipment as the logistical support on the ground to maximize its potential. That's why combat vehicles are of paramount importance in any war. The Stryker is one such piece of hardware that's been donated to Ukraine. The US confirmed that 90 Strykers would be dispatched shortly. Then you have to consider Ukraine's air defenses. Toward the end of 2022, the US sent the Patriot missile system to Kyiv, with the Netherlands and Germany quickly doing likewise. But what does this system bring to the table? Highly sophisticated, it has a range of up to 60 miles, 100 kilometers, depending on the type of missile deployed. However, it does have its downsides, and that could severely handicap the Ukrainians in the short term. Most significantly, operatives require highly specialized training, which will likely have to be carried out at a US Army base in Germany. And again, military hardware does not come cheap. One Patriot system costs about $3 million to operate. However, the importance of such systems cannot be exaggerated. They will greatly help to further bolster Ukraine's air defenses. Since the start of the conflict, they've been using old Soviet-era S-300 surface-to-air systems. Zelensky has attempted to replenish his stock of around 250 with similar systems stockpiled in other former Soviet countries, some of which have come from Slovakia. We aren't finished yet, though, not by a long shot. The US has also provided NASAMS, National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile System, and the UK several supplementary air defense systems, including Starstreak. which aims to destroy low-flying aircraft at short range. What about rockets? The US and some European nations have supplied the M142 High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, or HIMARS, and other similar systems. The latter in particular has been an essential component to Ukraine's success in forcing Russian troops back to the south, as they did in Kherson in November 2022. Howitzers have also played a vital role in the conflict so far. Australia, Canada, the US, and other countries have sent advanced M777 howitzers and ammunition to their beleaguered Ukrainian allies. In terms of range, the M777 is similar to Russia's Jiansint B howitzer and much longer than Putin's D-30 towed gun. But as the saying goes, a gun without bullets is no more than an expensive club, and clubs aren't going to cut it in this war. That's why NATO countries are planning to dramatically increase their supply of shells. Heavier production and swifter delivery are another key factor if Ukraine's going to win against Russia. At the height of the hostilities, it's estimated that Putin's troops were firing a staggering 25,000 to 30,000 shells a day. It doesn't take a mathematical genius to know that equates to over 1,000 shells an hour. Then we have drones. Ukraine has used drone technology to great effect so far, be it for standard surveillance or targeting operations or more complex missions. Drones have given Ukraine the edge over Russia in countless skirmishes. Interestingly, Turkey has sold a number of their Bayraktar TB2 armed drones to Ukraine, a low-cost alternative to the more expensive US models. But they've also supplied further drones to Zelensky via a unique crowdfunding scheme. A very modern twist to an increasingly modern form of warfare. But perhaps the most important piece of the military hardware puzzle, certainly if Ukraine hopes to win against Russia, is fighter jets. At the start of the conflict, President Joe Biden was reluctant to provide Zelensky with the aerial support he so desperately wanted. However, in May 2023, he backtracked and agreed not only to supply Ukraine with F-16s, but also train their pilots on how to operate them. Since then, Denmark and Norway have pledged to provide Kyiv with a combined number of 35 more F-16s and support the jets from the ground. Combined, all of the above military aid packages might be just enough to swing the war back in Ukraine's favor. But you can have all the tanks, the missiles, and fighter jets in the world, and they won't mean a thing if you don't have the correct strategy. By Zelensky's own admission, 2023's spring offensive wasn't anywhere near as successful as he had hoped. Now, the talk coming out of both Moscow and Kyiv is more about consolidation than engagement. Whether that'll be the case for long remains to be seen. Aside from the vital military aid packages, Ukraine has one other ace up its sleeve: President Volodymyr Zelensky himself. Often lampooned in the Russian press, Zelensky didn't take the typical political route into office. A comic actor of some repute, he starred in the Love in the Big City franchise and provided the voiceover for the Ukrainian version of Paddington. His crossover into politics was as unlikely as it was meteoric. But no one who has watched one of his impassioned addresses since the invasion could argue that he is not an articulate and impressive political figure in his own right now. From the outset, Zelensky became a symbol of defiance against the Russian aggressors. With dignity and zeal, he faced the world's press and appealed for help from the international community. Most notably in December 2022, when he traveled to the US and gave a stirring speech to Congress with the Ukrainian flag in the background. This flag is a symbol of our victory in this war. We stand, we fight, and we will win because we are united. Ukraine, America, and the entire free world. It was this combination that endeared him to a global audience. He went on to tell Congress any military aid packages weren't charity, but an investment in global security and democracy. In an interview with Politico magazine in December last year, Fiona Hill, a British-American author and foreign affairs specialist, went a step further. Ukraine has become a battlefield now for America and America's own future. For Putin, Ukraine is a proxy war against the United States to remove the United States from the world stage. Both are valid points that succinctly define not just the current situation in Ukraine, but in the Middle East too, where tensions have risen considerably in recent months. Zelensky's wife Elena has also had an important role to play on the international stage. Like her husband, she's worked tirelessly to bring global attention to the Ukrainian plight. Over the last 2 years, she appeared in countless interviews to both plead for further support and highlight the devastation that's being wreaked over the country by Putin's forces. Back in November 2022, when the onset of the winter and the devastating power cuts had started to take such a terrible toll on the Ukrainian people, especially in the south and the east, Olena could not have been more inspiring or defiant. We are ready to endure this. We've had so many terrible challenges, seen so many victims, so much destruction, that blackouts are not the worst thing to happen to us. She went on to discuss a recent poll where 90% of Ukrainians said they were ready to live with electricity shortages for 2 to 3 years if the prospect of joining the European Union was put on the table. Sometimes it can be very difficult, she went on to say, but there are some new emotions that help us to hold on. But how far have Zelensky's stores of energy been diminished by the sheer psychological toll of being the leader of a nation under attack? In some of the later press conferences during the 2-year conflict, the usually clean-shaven Ukrainian leader sported a beard. His forehead appeared lined and furrowed, and his eyes had heavy bags underneath. According to Glenn Patrick Doyle, a psychologist who specializes in trauma, Zelensky is displaying all the signs of a man under so much pressure that he may be on the verge of a nervous breakdown. The thing to understand about trauma in the body is that stress responses kind of hijack every otherwise normal function of our body. Worrying signs, especially considering that particular report came only 3 months after the Russian invasion. Without their charismatic, influential leader and his wife continuing to champion the country's cause and secure further military aid, Ukraine may struggle to boost troop morale on the front line. Together, they've presented a human face to the conflict and become representative of the Ukrainian people's struggle to not just defend their territories, but to escape from the yoke of a violent oppressor. For over 70 years, the country was part of the Soviet experiment and everything that came with it. Now the Ukrainian people look to the West, hoping to prosper and strike new economic alliances. Quite simply, they want better lives for themselves, one that's being denied to them by the vast shadow being cast across their nation by the Kremlin. If Ukraine hopes to win this war against Russia, they will need the Zelenskys to champion their cause with the same eloquence and determination as they did at the outset of the invasion. But there is perhaps one more consideration that we've only touched upon in this video so far: the strength and determination of the Ukrainian people, especially the troops fighting on the front line. Retired Lieutenant General Mark Hertling, who commanded the 1st Armored Division and Multinational Task Force Iron in Iraq, and later commanded the U.S. Army Europe, made this revealing prediction in an interview with the Washington Post back in February 2023. Ukraine will fight above its weight class and Russia will be embarrassed. We've covered some of the crucial things Ukraine needs to win the war against Russia, but what factors could stand in their way? In the short term, and at this point, no one can say for certain how long the conflict will last. There are 2 potential huge stumbling blocks Ukraine is rightly wary of. The first, war weariness. While most certainly a galling, almost insulting proposition to the Ukrainian people, citizens in the West, even many of those who took to the streets by the thousands to protest against the invasion, have become tired of the conflict. Even though they fully supported Ukraine, many believe that the military aid packages supplied by their governments have only prolonged the war, perhaps indefinitely at the cost of many more thousands of lives. This was emphasized late last year when a U.S. Senate vote saw Republicans block $50 billion in new security assistance to the country. Meanwhile, Jack Waltington, a senior research fellow for land warfare at the Royal United Services Institute, wrote in the UK newspaper The Guardian that the EU has just delivered 300,000 of the 1 million shells it promised in March. Remember the starting stat we revealed at the beginning of the video, that Russian troops are firing 25,000 to 30,000 shells a day? What the EU has delivered is a shortfall, if there ever was one. And while it may be somewhat cynical to cloak it in such terms, it appears that the conviction of the people in the West is seriously wavering. Ironically, this ties in with Glenn Patrick Doyle's observation regarding Zelensky's physical decline, where before his unflagging spirit and charisma wooed the Western world, he now cuts a far less dynamic figure. 2 years down the line and he too is showing the same kind of weariness as the rest of the world. Then there are the events in the Middle East, primarily Israel's war on Hamas, and the brutal invasion of the Gaza Strip. The horrific images shown on the television news, the ever-growing death toll, many thousands of whom have been children, and the endless shelling have had a demoralizing effect, relegating the conflict in Ukraine to an editorial afterthought in many publications. How many conflicts can nations and in turn their citizens condemn or support and rally against? But perhaps most tellingly of all, Zelensky and his people will be keeping a close eye on the presidential election in the United States. Why? During his time in office, former President Donald Trump championed an unabashed and unapologetic America First policy. Moreover, Trump has publicly declared his admiration for the Russian leader Vladimir Putin. If Trump were to return to power, therefore the unthinkable could happen. He would cut off support to Ukraine, the ramifications of which are too terrible to contemplate. But the painful reality of the situation is that the Trump bandwagon continues to roll on, despite a slew of serious indictments, including electoral fraud bordering upon treason. Trump looks not only likely to be the Republican candidate in November's U.S. presidential election, but he currently holds a lead over the current incumbent Joe Biden in the polls. Back in February 2022, Trump somewhat complacently boasted, "If I were in office, this deadly Ukraine situation would have never happened." More worryingly, UK newspaper The Telegraph quoted the former president as saying, "The Democrats are sending another $40 billion to Ukraine, yet America's parents are struggling to even feed their children," in a statement issued through his Save America PAC back in May of last year. Taking all that into account, does Ukraine have any place on Trump's Make America Great Again agenda? Time will only tell. We've put forward a case for what needs to happen for Ukraine to win its war against Russia, but we haven't said anything thus far about the time frame. As we've already mentioned, the Russian leadership clearly envisioned a swift and emphatic victory. But when that didn't happen, they had to take a step back and reassess the situation. In contrast, the defiant rhetoric that came out of Kyiv, particularly from Zelensky and his most senior aides, was that Ukraine would never surrender. So, have we reached the irresistible force meeting the immovable object stage? Again, it's incredibly difficult to say. What's becoming increasingly certain, though, here at the beginning of 2024 is that the nature and the tenor of the war will change. Journalist and foreign affairs expert Sean Walker, someone who has covered the conflict extensively, told the Guardian newspaper, "Russia has built incredibly dense defensive fortifications, which will make it almost impossible for Ukraine to advance." But how do we assess Russia's military strength and capacity to launch new offensives at the beginning of 2024? We've already touched upon the vast losses Putin has suffered since the invasion, both in terms of manpower and military hardware. But he is nothing if not a ruthless and pragmatic leader. Even if he initially envisaged a swift end to the war, he's now recalibrated his objectives. Victory, it now appears, could look very different from how Russia initially envisioned it, and will constitute more of a partitioning of great swaths of Ukrainian territories. This would have a twofold benefit. Firstly, the Kremlin could package these gains as a victory, especially in light of Western intervention and the huge military aid packages that have been part of it, so as to not lose face with the general public. Second, and most importantly, these territories would offer a significant buffer zone between any further planned NATO expansion and Russia's current borders. On paper, it's a win-win for Putin, even if the main strategic objective was to destroy Zelensky and install a puppet government in Kyiv back in 2022. Besides, there are many bigger prizes on the potential horizon for Russia. We need only to look at Putin's vast expansion in the Arctic region and opening up of the North Atlantic trade route, linking Russia with the lucrative Asian markets. For those reasons and more, ultimate victory in Ukraine was always merely a piece of the Russian leader's wider geopolitical vision. Maybe, therefore, the idea of a negotiated ceasefire, very much on Putin's terms, and a compromise that was first bandied about in the spring of 2022, might be the natural, logical conclusion of the conflict. Either way, Putin will most certainly leverage the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to his benefit. As Fiona Hill summed up the attitude of the Western people, "Look, we're always dealing with Europe's problems. We need to be dealing with the Middle East here. This is more consequential for everyone." For many military experts, however, 2024 looks likely to be a year of further stalemate. In the same Guardian report we quoted from earlier, Sean Walker qualified his previous statements about Russia's defenses. The fortifications also stop the Russians because they would have to get through the massive minefields they've laid. For that reason, 2025 could well be the decisive year of the conflict, not 2024. But make no mistake, Ukraine can still win against Russia. If the US presidential campaign could turn the nature of the conflict on its head, the EU's decision to open membership talks with Ukraine and Moldova might be just as significant. It means continued backing for Kyiv, as a future in the EU for Ukraine would be impossible with a full-blown victory for Russia. It would be a warning shot across the Kremlin's bow if there ever was one. If Ukraine could gain membership status and enter into solid economic and security partnerships, it would secure the long-term prosperity and future of the country for the next generation. What do you think? Can Ukraine realistically win this war with Russia? Or do you think that prevailing global factors like the situation in the Middle East and Israel's brutal war with Hamas might play a deciding role? Tell us what you think in the comments. Then check out Could Alliance of China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran destroy NATO? Or watch this video instead.